Earlier this week, a series of planned visits by the Governor-General of Canada, Mary Simon, to charities in Quebec City were cut short when it became apparent that the Governor-General wasn't able to meaningfully interact with staff and volunteers in French. This has caused renewed criticisms by francophone Canadians that the Governor-General doesn't speak French, which run up against responses by supporters of the Governor-General that, as an Indigenous woman, she speaks Inuktitut and English, and that should be enough. I can't speak for every francophone in Canada, but as a francophone who is worried by this, I thought I could share why I feel this is a problem. First, intentionally or not, my concern is this seems like it's perpetuating a long-standing colonial practice of pitting minorities against one another so that the dominant group comes out on top. By selecting a Governor-General who doesn't speak French, one of Canada's official languages, but does speak Inuktitut, one of Canada's Indigenous languages, the federal government has essentially pit those interested in the rights of francophones against those interested in the rights of Indigenous languages. Both groups are minorities in Canada with legitimate concerns for their respective cultural rights, and by putting them in opposition to one another in this way, the real winner is the dominance of English. Because don't get me wrong, I'm very happy that Canada has an Indigenous Governor-General who speaks an Indigenous language. That's a huge gain for Indigenous people across the country, and I applaud it. But that didn't necessarily have to be done at the expense of a Governor-General who also speaks French, even though I know there are a lot of federal government surrogates who seem to be saying it was a necessary trade-off. There are today highly competent Indigenous people who speak an Indigenous language and both of Canada's official languages. Second, I'm concerned because it's a broken promise with respect to French language rights coming from the person who is, constitutionally speaking, the highest office holder in Canada. When Mary Simon was first named Governor-General 3 years ago, a lot of francophone Canadians like me set aside their concerns that she didn't speak French because she promised that she would learn as quickly as she could. We took her at her word and accepted a small loss in francophone representation rights in favor of unity with Indigenous people across Canada. 3 years later, it's become apparent that she hasn't held up her end of the bargain. Francophone Canadians across the country know that their rights rely in large part on the promises of the federal government to maintain their rights. If the Governor-General, Canada's highest officer, doesn't, what does that say about how much we should believe the rest of the federal government's promises with respect to Francophone rights? Nobody is expecting her French to be perfect. It takes years to master a language. That's not the standard we're holding her to. But according to reports, after 3 years, she can't understand simple phrases or engage in basic exchanges in French. What are we supposed to make out of that? And finally, my third major concern is that this sets a precedent, and precedents have the tendency to lose the nuance behind them. When the next prime minister, or the one after that, has to name a new governor-general, they could again choose to name one who doesn't speak French. And if we don't raise our objections against this now, by then, all people might remember is that, well, Mary Simon didn't speak French, and that didn't seem to be a big deal. If there's one thing minorities always have to remember that the dominant group sometimes gets to forget, it's that we always have to be thinking about the future. I want a future where respecting both our official languages doesn't have to be in opposition to giving more room to Indigenous languages too.